This interview is brought to you in association with Rabobank.
Hello and welcome to another in our online rural delivery interviews. I'm Roger Bourne and today I'm speaking with Blake Holgate, Rural Manager, Sustainable Farm Systems at Rabobank. Blake, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Roger. Great to be here.
You've just authored a report, The Other Side of Environmental Regulations, What It Means for NZ Sheep and Beef Farmers. Now, sheep and beef farming, not an area where I was necessarily expecting Rabobank to be writing environmental reports. What's prompted this?
Probably partially for that reason exactly, Roger. There's been a strong focus on the environmental impact of dairying on the environment and the impact of regulatory rules on the dairy sector, and not so much a focus on sheep and beef. So we thought it was important to highlight, one, what are the environmental risks that flow from sheep and beef farms, and secondly, what are the rules and regulations that sheep and beef farmers need to be aware of, highlighting how they'll impact their business and encouraging them to participate in the plan change process probably to a larger extent than they have to date.
Okay, well, let's look at those two things. Firstly, the environmental impact of a sheep and beef property. Explain the sort of things you've seen and how they might be mitigated potentially.
Yeah, so sheep and beef farms, the environmental risk is much more around those contaminants that run off the surface. So we're talking about your sediment, your phosphorus, your erosion risk, and potentially some E. coli risk. Where dairying, the focus is much more around the nitrogen and the concentration of urine patches that flow into the groundwater. So sheep and beef farmers probably should be focusing their mitigation measures much more around controlling the water that's running off the top of the surface into the waterways, and that's around sort of cultivation practices, spreading of fertiliser, stock access to waterways, and those good management practices that can manage and mitigate some of those risks.
So relatively simple steps there.
Yeah, it's just probably understanding the pathways that those contaminants take to get into the waterways, and then understanding those practices that best suit your farm and your farming system to address those risks. Contaminants, those kind of contaminants largely flow to what we call the critical source areas. So the idea that 80% of the contaminant loss might come from 20% of the land. So targeting those mitigation practices to that 20%.
So the thing there to clarify my earlier point is that relatively simple practices, however, you need quite a strong underpinning level of knowledge about how the biology of your particular farm is working in order to be able to make those actions. So is that sort of knowledge generally available, do you think, in the sheep and beef farming community?
Yeah, I think it's increasingly becoming available, Roger. Look, there's some great online resources. Beef and Lamb has some. Beef and Lamb also run their Land Environment Plan program, which I'd really encourage sheep and beef farmers to get along to. So it's a full-day workshop where you take your farm map or plan along, and they'll discuss with you and help you identify the risk areas on your farm, and then highlight some of the mitigation options you've got available, and then help you plan into the future around what would work best in your farm, and put some time frames around some of those actions. So yeah, look, I think the information is out there. I think we could probably get more information, and I think going forward we'll start to see much more information starting to flow to farmers.
And on the regulatory side, what sort of information are the regulators looking at, and what sort of regulation are we seeing coming in this regard?
Yeah, so in terms of the relevance for sheep and beef farmers, regulators are looking at those rules and regulations that will mitigate or minimise the flow of those surface contaminants that we talked about before. So how can we minimise erosion and sediment and E. coli losses? So they'll put rules in place that will encourage or require good management practices be applied on farm to mitigate some of those risks. So an example is excluding stock from waterways, and there's different approaches they can take to managing that risk. So it may be a rule that simply says a farmer cannot cause any damage to the bed of a waterway flowing through their farm, and leave that up to the individual farmer to decide how to do it. Or they can have a rule that requires a farmer to fence all their waterways. So again, that's important that farmers understand the different approaches regulators can take and understand how they could impact their business.
And of course, regulation will depend on the local body who has that authority. How's that looking across the country? Is it patchy? There's some areas that are particularly adopting one set of rules versus the other. We're going to have some form of consistency.
Yeah, so under the Freshwater National Policy Statement, every one of New Zealand's 16 regional authorities are required to implement changes to maintain or improve water quality, but they have till 2025 to achieve that. And we're seeing different approaches across New Zealand, both in terms of the rules being put in place, but also the timings of those rules. So in some regions like Horizons and Otago, we've already seen the plan changes and the rules operative now. And in other places throughout the country, we're still in the very early stages of the plan change process, which does create an element of uncertainty across New Zealand and a lack of consistency, which potentially does create some frustration.
Yeah, and potentially for research and other investment. But there's also an opportunity, right? If not every area has put rules in place, I assume there's an opportunity here for the farming community to work proactively with those regulators and make sure that they get rules and regulations which are not only appropriate in terms of the outcomes being sought, but that actually enable the sort of activities that allow a farmer to continue to farm profitably and actually have the effect that's being sought.
Yeah, absolutely, Roger, and that's exactly what we are seeing now. So I think if you looked at some of those early plan changes that went through in regions perhaps like Horizons, the agriculture industry sort of learnt lessons from there and is doing a better job, I think, at coordinating some of its responses to these plan changes in the regions. They're learning lessons from what's been done elsewhere. We're seeing a lot more investment around some of the science and also some of the economics of these plan changes. So industry is now turning up at plan changes much better prepared and much clearer about some of the outcomes it wants to achieve.
What sort of influence do you think farmers can actually have on that process?
Well, I think they can have a huge influence, but I think it's important that they get in early in the plan change process to help inform councils around some of the practicalities of the rules that potentially are being drawn up. Councils may have the best intentions, not necessarily trying to restrict a farmer or a farming system, but may just not be aware of the implications of the rules they're putting in place. But by turning up early to some of those plan change discussion meetings and making councils aware of that, they can affect some real change. And if they don't want to do it directly, it's also probably just through supporting industry organisations whose job it is to do that, such as Fed Farmers. So supporting them with information and feedback around how their regionally specific rules are impacting farmers in their region.
Are there lessons to be learned here from the experience of the dairy sector?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first of all, sheep and beef farmers need to understand, as dairy farmers have, that good environmental practice is now a core function of farming. So it needs to be incorporated into the day-to-day management decisions and long-term investment decisions, just as we would stock, pasture, or financial management. It's no longer something that can be just put in a box off to the side. And also probably reiterating the point we discussed before, it's about understanding it's really important to engage with regional authorities when plan changes are being developed and engaging early to help really form some of those policies and rules.
Is there also a lesson that may not necessarily be about wholesale farm system changes and more about a mindset change?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's probably important to understand too what we're seeing in the dairy sector is also there's some benefits and positives that are coming out of this process. Farmers are getting a much better understanding of their farming systems, how their land, water, soil and farming systems are interacting. And once they start understanding it, they can start to adopt some efficiencies and build that into their farming systems.
What about growing that understanding? I assume here that there's going to be a pretty hefty component of R&D required, both for the regulator and for the farmers trying to respond.
Yeah, Correct. The reality is if we want to achieve the higher level of environmental standard that community and society are demanding and that we all want to see, whilst also remaining productive and profitable, R&D has a huge role to play in allowing us to do that, to probably bridge the gap between where we are now and where we need to get to. I think regulation will encourage that investment in that R&D. There hasn't probably been that same requirement without the regulation, but now that we have it, it's a pretty strong incentive to see investment flow into that area. So it's important we do the R&D, but it's also important that we have strong coordination between farmer, industry and government to ensure that the findings from that R&D are coming out to farmers with some pretty clear and consistent messages around tangible on-farm actions that can be taken.
Now, Blake, in your industry, is there a role here for the banks? If there's a new cost that's going to come on board for farmers, perhaps going to have an impact on their bottom line potentially, or there might be larger investments in one year versus the other, a role for the banking industry in supporting the sort of on-farm change that may be required?
Yeah, well I know we see our role as helping farmers get the right information to help them make the right decisions when they do potentially need to make changes. So, yes, some of these changes will increase compliance costs, but it's understanding what is the most effective way to get those changes and comply with what I need to in the most cost-effective manner, or if I'm making a major farm system change or investment decision, again, how can I achieve what I want to do in the most cost-effective manner, which will ensure I'm being productive and profitable as I possibly can. So we really see it as sort of that raising awareness and helping provide access to information.
Great. Now, speaking of access to information, before we go, where can farmers access a copy of the report?
Yeah, so our clients will receive a copy of the report via email. If they're not a client, just get in contact with one of your local Rabobank representatives, and I'm sure they'll be able to supply you a copy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Blake. Much appreciate your time. We'll talk again, I'm sure.
No, thanks for that, Roger.
This interview was brought to you in association with Rabobank.